Good morning, everyone. This is Kathy Mason from MasonWorks Marketing here on Conscious Business Zone with my new friend, Meghan Dotter. Hi, Meghan. How are you?
Great. How are you?
Great, great. Well, I'm very excited to learn from you today, and I hope that there'll be lots of words of wisdom that people will take away from this conversation because you guys, Meghan is an expert at presentation training. And as we know in the business world, almost every other call is a slide deck, a pitch sheet, a one sheet for speakers. Everything is about communicating in a succinct and pleasant way. And she's built her whole career about transforming speakers and helping them figure out what they really want to say and a better way to say it. And she's really enjoys that part. She has a company called Portico PR, and she does training as well as consulting and coaching, and it's a design firm. And she's written a really cool book that hopefully we get to learn about today called The Reluctant Presenter. So with that, how did you get into this? Was there a time period when you were growing up that you just went, why do they say it that way? Why can't they speak clearly? Was there something like that that happened that made you go, I'm going to fix that?
It didn't happen until later. And I would say that for, most of my childhood and then career, I avoided being the center of attention. I actually think back to, I was in third grade and there was a local game show in Washington, D.C. and I was one of the participants and I prepared and prepared and prepared. I remember being so proud of having my yellow Oshkosh Bagosh overalls and my green, collar with a popped up because it was the 80s. And I completely froze. And, things didn't get much better from there. And so I came across this and I really started to think that there was something that we could do differently when I was in-house in communications, and it was during the financial crisis. And as you can imagine, the meetings are pretty intense. And I remember thinking I am not following people. And so I started to think about different ways that experts could position their information. And, I think because it's something that did not come naturally to me and I had to overcome my own reluctance about being center stage, that made it easier to break down all of the parts of why presentations can be so difficult. And, when I say present, it could be giving an update to the board. It could be speaking up at a staff meeting or a panel. I think it's pretty much every time you open your mouth at work. So it's a pretty expansive view of that.
I think that communications, that's why I do what I do too in media, is that I think communications is evolving and hopefully getting more and more and more loving and kind and relationship building. As I mentioned to you, I really see this time period adjusting from old ways of doing things to a new way of doing things more as team, where you want everyone on board with the same information. It's not this pyramid where only the boss knows what's really going on. And so these presentations in a way to get consensus and get buy-in and get the energy going towards projects is really necessary. So could you tell me one of your favorite transformation stories of somebody came to you with they were trying to get sponsorships or they were trying to do something and their slide deck was just horrible? and could you share something like that?
Sure. And when you talk about the missed opportunities and why it's so important, not only was it firsthand, I knew how difficult it was to leave a meeting and think wow, no one understood what I was talking about. I didn't get that yes or that approval. It might not have been because of the merits of the idea. It's because I simply wasn't able to communicate in a way. And you see organizationally that leaders miss out on getting the best from their talent. So they go out and they recruit these high potential, really smart, hardworking individuals. But if you don't have those skills to communicate and advocate for an idea and navigate that political landscape, you're simply not getting that collaboration.
Right.
I said, I'm trying to think of like some of my favorites. One of them, I will call her Claudia. She was a product, or she still is a product manager, and she was relatively new to this global organization. And she would go up each quarter and give a recommendation on the product that she thought they should go in and explore a little bit more to create some more market share. And she said, I just felt like I was giving all of these pre-briefings, and then there was never any traction. And when we talked to her before the first workshop, she had this almost exasperation. And she was like, what do you mean there's a presentation and workshop? She's like, I spent, 7 months working on one, and I'm not I've gone through 2 quarterly reviews and that there's been no traction. And so we worked with her to think about how this presentation fit into the broader framework of how leadership at her company made decisions. I think it's so easy to get so focused on, what do my slides say? What is everything I could share on about this topic? But yet if you step back and think, okay, this is one part of the bigger issue. Where do they decide? How do I sell this beforehand? What are the main issues that people are going to say yes or no on? And so in the preparation for giving that formal presentation, what Claudia found is she was doing a lot more one-on-one conversations with her colleagues and getting the backstory on the history of other product launches and why certain people said yes and no. And so once she was finally in front of her colleagues, and it was a big, cultural shift for her, she went on camera. Everyone in this organization was off camera, which, for so many reasons breaks my heart. But she went on camera and she said, I knew what the questions were going to come in. I knew that I had pretty much sold this idea already to over half of the room. And she said at the end of her presentation, she got applause. And she said, people never applaud at the review meetings. And, for someone who was so skeptical of what training could do and how trying a different approach might work, to hear her say, like, I'm not going back to the other way. I'm not going to go back to just reading from my slides and staying off camera and kind of hoping everything happens the day of. I'm really going to use my network. And so that's one of my favorite before and after stories, because she's cool. And so now her product's in stores now. It's exciting.
Oh, that's so cool. So I ran a division of Arthur Andersen over 20 years ago with 80 employees, and we would break people into teams. Well, first we would be a team to sell the project, and the projects were big. This wasn't your $250,000 project. They were big, $1 million projects. And so there would be a bunch of us, and I was lucky that I didn't have to do all the slides on that. And we actually had a database, they called it a knowledge base, that we could go back to if you had sold a systems. So it was IT, a lot of it was IT projects, large implementation projects. And if you had sold a bank this package before, you could go and get somebody else's slide deck that was successful and then take it and edit it. So we weren't starting from scratch. But what I found that was hard about that is the people that were implementing it weren't the people that were selling it. And so we would be scrambling, like, what did the customer think they were buying from our sales pitch? And I was even there trying to fulfill, with my inventory of employees who are all just incredibly talented, bright stars, brilliant, but you want to put them in a place that can succeed, and you weren't even sure what they thought they bought. So when people are doing presentations, do you have them do an outline of, as part of your process, tell them what you're going to tell them again and tell them again? Is there a format like that, a structure to it?
So we have formats, we call them our toolkit. And because one of my frustrations when I was going through professional development and taking my own journey and learning how to become a more effective communicator was that there would be this great idea in the moment. But then when I would go to actually apply it, I would be like, well, what did they say? And I don't know if that really applies to where I work. And so my team and I are very methodical about putting step-by-step prompts. Whether you're preparing a briefing or you are helping colleagues come to a decision, or maybe you've got a call to action, or maybe you're telling a story. So, we can break down so many different ways we want to communicate, and we have prompts. Now, every one of them are going to encourage you to think about, okay, what is that goal that you want? Or what is that one piece of information that if your audience didn't get, you haven't done your job? And how will your audience be changed? And to really explore who's in the room, what are their motivations, what do they want? And then depending on the purpose of that meeting, it's vastly different if it's brainstorming versus, again, you want them to follow a call to action. And we have a series of prompts that will help you organize your ideas so that you're not simply reciting a list of talking points. Talking points require a great deal of work. I have written hundreds, if not thousands of them, lockstep with corporate counsel. It's like the approved language. But on their own, they're not telling a story, and therefore they don't really resonate with your audience. So in order to make those talking points come to life and get your audience invested, it's helpful to answer those questions of what's the urgency, if any, and what happens if I follow this call to action? What will mean for us in this organization if we get those shared goals? And to ask some of the harder questions of, why might your audience say no? Why might they say yes? What are the resource constraints they're struggling with? And so the more speakers can think through these prompts in the toolkit, the more strategic they can be about what they say. Because the vast majority of speakers, I definitely fell victim of this, it's out of a good place, but we simply overwhelm our audience by sharing everything we could say about a topic. And so we follow these prompts, and then you realize like, oh, I actually don't need as much. I probably only need like 30% of what I was going to share. And then you let the Q&A and the discussion decide what about that other information might your audience need. I will say there's no like sacrosanct presentation advice other than practice aloud and know your audience. But I do struggle with the tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, because it is a little bit repetitive. And so I just think there are other frameworks of thinking, how will this information change your audience and be of service to them in some way? That's the biggest shift I think is helpful for organizing your ideas.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned real quickly something about story, and do you find that that's by you sharing your story or the story of how this benefits their company by explaining a case study, do you find that stories are really important in some of your formulas?
Absolutely. I would say stories are the most efficient, most effective way if you want to earn someone's trust, build credibility, change their mind, and incentivize them to take action. And there's phenomenal research led by Professor Paul Zak out at Claremont University. He's a neuroeconomist who, he describes his fascination with storytelling as being on an airplane ride, and he was watching Million Dollar Baby. And he finds himself, having this emotional reaction where he's sobbing, like, as he describes it, ugly sobbing. And he's like, why am I doing this in front of all of these strangers? And because he's a professor, he goes to the lab and breaks down everything of what happens. And so, I think story is one of those terms that you ask, and I do ask, whenever our facilitators, whenever in workshops, like, how would you define story? And we're not asking this to be, super detail or exact, but unless a story in this setting to be effective in communication has a character who experiences some sort of conflict in pursuit of a goal and learns something from that, it's not going to be as effective as a communication tool as other things. I would say that stories are a wonderful thing to have, but the core skill that every speaker needs is how to build a narrative. And that is simply connecting an idea to your audience. Most speakers, if they did that, our weekly staff meetings would be must-see TV. We would not roll our eyes and we saw like, oh, we've got to give another presentation. So build a narrative. If you can get your audience to say yes, you can get their buy-in, that's all you need. But if you have an idea that that it goes against what your audience experiences or believes, what can happen is you poke the bear, because as humans, we like to be right. And so if you tell me something that I disagree with, you've triggered all of this super critical, highly analytical thinking. And you've activated me to retrieve every data point, anecdote I can explain that will prove you wrong.
Right.
And this kind of convergent thinking is wonderful for solving problems, for brainstorming, for really thinking, okay, what's wrong with this idea? When you already know what you want people to do, that's when you want them to do what they call convergent thinking. And that's where storytelling comes into play. And the reason these stories need a character is because when you get lost, like what's the last great book you've read, Kathy, or movie you watched, or Netflix series?
Oh my, Chuck.
Do
you remember Chuck?
No, I haven't seen that one. Okay,
Chuck is a nerd, and he ends up putting on these glasses, and the whole database of the FBI and the CIA goes in his head.
Okay.
And then the CIA, he falls in love with his handler, and there's like 5 years of them, and it's a love story. Anyway.
And you can tell the emotion in your voice, like it still resonates with you. What happens when we get lost in these characters is we become so invested, in your case, in what happens to Chuck.
Yeah.
That all of that analytical thinking that got you so fired up before, it kind of stands back.
Right.
And so that's why these stories can change the way we view the world and see issues. So that's why character-led stories can be so powerful in our communication.
That's great. Okay, so we're just getting out a year out of the lockdown, and presentations that might have been done across a boardroom table with a projector or in a video conference with some physical people there, and then maybe someone else from afar on the screen. Have you seen a big change with how presentations need to go because of this new technology of communication, where you don't see but part of somebody? And okay, so that was the first question, and then the next. Well, I'll wait for the next one. But so I'm just wondering, because what you're saying about presentation, it's applicable for either medium, but I'm wondering if it's harder on this technology or easier on this technology to use slides or a pre-created presentation.
For most speakers, there's an overwhelming preference for in-person communication. Right. So if you're asking about virtual or hybrid, the thing that has the best outcome of having been virtual for so long is that we realized very quickly that we could not read the room the way we could in person. And it wasn't until March 2020 that I realized just how much I relied on what they call micro expressions of, maybe it's a furrowed brow or a shift in body language to figure out whether what I was saying was resonating or not. And, we had so many clients, a new breed of clients in private equity, who came to us and they were like, we don't have the relationship building anymore because we can't be in, we're all stuck at home. How do we make the most of this? And so I think people have gotten better about being more intentional about two things. One is, how do you build in those times to develop relationship and have small talk that's a little bit more interesting than the weather before you jump right in? And the other one is to be intentional about leaving space for your audience to react. So, when it comes to asking a question, if you're one of those people who struggles with silence and you want to fill the space, our recommendation is to count to 10 silently. And that will give your audience time to formulate their thoughts, take themselves off mute, maybe go on camera, and maybe have more check-ins. so that you're not, mowing through the content, but you're having more deliberate stops and check-ins to hear, is this what you're expecting? Do you want more detail? And really helping your audience guide you a bit more. And so we've heard from our clients that it's been easier to take that intentionality
Oh, good.
back into the physical space as well.
Good.
Yeah.
So are most of your clients now back in physical presentations, or is it still hybrid?
It's hybrid. It's mixed. I think most of them have hybrid work situations or virtual board meetings. I would say it's 50-50. Some are all virtual, some are getting back into person. And obviously the energy of people being in person is just so much better. It's
It's easier to read for sure. And it's also the confidence factor for the speaker is so much higher because you can prove your credibility when there's engagement in person. Because people seem to be more apt to ask a question and play with you rather than you being this stoic presenter. Is anyone there kind of thing? So, okay. So what do you recommend when there's a presentation that there's multiple presenters where like it would be a board of directors where the president starts out and then says, treasurer, you do your part, and some of the other key board members have to speak. Is there a specific way that you suggest that people should, mostly for the leader, to make sure that he or she, it'd be nice if they were all she's, but they aren't, how they manage the interaction?
I will use a sports analogy for this one because I find that this is true for any speaker, whether you're speaking individually as a team. If you're waiting until you're in front of the room or the camera to hear how it sounds for the first time, I call this a magician, that somehow everything miraculously is going to come together. You really put yourself at a huge disadvantage. And so my sports analogy is, a football team or basketball team, like pick your sport, any team sport would never go out to the playing field and take out the, little whiteboard and talk about the play and say, well, you go wide receiver, you go run out and you hopefully catch that. Or maybe I'll throw it off, toss it off to the running back and they'll do this and then say, okay, that's great. And then go hit the locker room. No, like they work the plays, they practice and they get the timing right until they built that muscle memory. And I have been part of teams that have done this because I remember I have committed every presentation sent out there. I have observed teams do it where their practice session is, okay, I'm going to talk about this. Then you talk about Q2 results. And then you talk about, our strategy. And, you don't know what your person's going to say. So oftentimes you might be repeating. You might miss an opportunity to reinforce. Some of the most salient facts might not be brought up at all. So I would encourage teams that are presenting to think about practicing, use a timer so you know exactly how people are going to come in on time. And then to think more like sports radio or a talk show versus I'm Megan and now I'm going to hand off to Kathy. And now Kathy's going to talk about this. Like it just creates these little points of friction that and it, every team likes to say we're a collaborative team, we work together. And the best way to demonstrate that is to show up and give a presentation that makes it look like you all are seamless and you interact with one another all the time. So just practice aloud. I know it's awkward, but it's the best return on your investment for time.
I love that. I am a volunteer for this group that last year and the year before, we had a lot of panels at our, it was in person or on Zoom. So if there was a possibility to buy a ticket to hear these speakers and the panel, if you were selected to be on a panel, there was a lead manager of the panel. And then there were maybe 4 people. So each person only got 15 minutes. So one of my friends was head of part of it. And she must have had them practice 5 times. I mean, I don't think I didn't hear anyone else had, but it came out so smooth because it was like, oh, you want me now? What should I say? Number one, they had already practiced what they could say in 15, 20 minutes. And number two, they could build on each other so they could figure out whose story helped the other story. Because you, as much as possible, if there's a group, you want to do that. And it's uncanny how it happens naturally anyway. But have you seen that as well, where there's a panel presentation at an event? Because these people were on stage. This was live.
Mhm.
It wasn't virtual, and but they practiced on Zoom.
So panels are tricky, and I almost say they're almost like
Don't let go.
the Pinot Noir of wines. Either they're fantastic or they're undrinkable, which could be a little harsh. And it's because there's so many ways you could go with it. And the panels that tend to work the best are when they not only come up with like, what is that one thing I want the audience to know that they can't get from any place else? Because the best panels are you're getting, you feel like you're sitting in a conversation and you're getting perspectives and content that you can't get anywhere else. Even if you read all of their white papers, their books, listen to their podcast, it's that chemistry. And things that tend to help with that chemistry are when the moderator says, you know what, like, come up with 1 or 2 points, but also come up with a question that you have for the other panelists and maybe even the audience. And that's when you get that engagement and
That's a great idea.
curiosity. So, if you're like, okay, you know what? Here's another expert, or this person comes from the industry perspective or the government. What is something I've always wanted to ask? Even thinking that doesn't have to be a long practice rehearsal, but knowing that you're going to get some questions and be not, as a panelist, thinking it's not only am I going to share, but I'm going to ask. That's where you can get some great panel chemistry.
That sounds fantastic. I love that because the moderator, in this case, she wanted to speak too. She had signed up to be a speaker, and then she was made moderator, and so she wanted to at least get 5 minutes or get something out of
Airtime.
Yeah. And all of these, when you go to large events where there's at least $1,000 expense to go stay and hotel, nice hotels, food, and your networking. A lot of it is trying to connect with people and create relationships. Most of the live events are like that, but they are expensive. So if you're one of the presenters, you want to get FaceTime, right?
Mhm.
And it's precious, especially if it's only 15 minutes, right?
Absolutely.
So, okay, so I have another question for you.
Okay.
This is great. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Of course.
What have you experienced where you had to help people dress differently, wear different colors, put on makeup, do anything for their physical appearance in order to communicate better?
This is the conversation that no manager wants to have with their colleagues. And I actually address this in the book when it comes to presence. I think this is one of those issues that is evolving. And certainly the rules that I, heard when I was first going into the workforce in the mid 1990s have changed. You didn't wear walking shoes in the office building. Like, you had to change outside, like a block away and walk in, which, all those poor 9 West shoes that I destroyed. So here's what, and I remember having to have that conversation when I was a manager towards a friend and a colleague, and it is just super, super awkward. And so one of the things I encourage professionals to do is to simply develop an awareness of, is this something that matters at my organization? And the way you dress at Goldman Sachs is different than you're going to dress at Google. So it's part of your ability to read the room just as you would when you're communicating. So if you are the more junior person or employee and you're wondering, simply develop an awareness and maybe ask a question. It doesn't have to be your manager, but someone you can trust, of like, how important is it? How important is this? I was talking to a good friend of mine and former client, and we were catching up because he just started a new job at a tech company. And, we're of the same age. We went to college at the same time. And he was like, it's a great, team and everything. He's like, but I just don't know about the professionalism. And he said, because I have a sales team and they're getting on calls selling 6-7 figure dollar deals, and they just jumped off the Peloton. And to me, that tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. Whereas I'm sure to the person who is working out is like, I'm healthy. I'm full of energy. So it's simply a discussion to ask your manager. And if you're not sure, and if you're the manager and that conversation is just waiting to happen, the best way to take it, critique and giving feedback can be so difficult. But when it truly comes from a place of, this is how I want to help you, that you do all this amazing work, you're putting in the effort. My concern is this might be an obstacle, that people might be perceiving you differently. And this is where our clients or our guests or our other colleagues, where they come from, simply having the courage to have that discussion. And, some people might say, you know what, it's not worth it. This isn't the right organization for me. And they move on. But more often than not, when the manager can come from that perspective of, here's what I wish someone told me, I realize that it might not be fair. It might not sound right. It might not fit with what your priorities are, but this is part of playing the game.
Perfect.
Just reality. Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. I agree a lot because you have to read your environment in order to be able to be part of the team. And if you don't, especially back in the day, there were lots of people, women didn't understand what working attire was, and they were wearing evening clothes to the office. And it's a little distracting. So that wasn't very professional, and it wasn't that comfortable either. Just like you're talking about shoes, wearing your tennies versus wearing high heels. And I did that a lot. Okay, so what I also was wondering about, though, is it used to be the color. They would say, a blue suit, wear certain colors, especially if you're on a live stage. So let's say you're advising someone that's doing a presentation to an association, and they've just published a book just like you. And they're up there, and they may want people after the book, after the presentation, they may get to sign the book and sell the book at the back of the room, hopefully. Do you usually have a conversation about what to wear for those stage performances? Is that something that you do as well? Because a lot of these large organizations, they're going to maybe sponsor an event and get stage time for one of their key employees, or other ways of being presenters.
It does make a difference when you're on stage. And I would say most of the work that we do is B2B. So it's for presentations in smaller settings. And for that, it's like, be comfortable, be professional. When you're on a stage, so much of it, like the theatrics of it matter. So for example, I did a presentation to an association last week, actually 2. So it's very timely. And one of my questions was,
perfect.
What is the background? Because you want to wear something that's in contrast to your skin coloring, but you also you want to make sure you're not like floating in the background. So, the camera usually works better with solids. As much as I love a classic herringbone or tweed, like it doesn't always work on camera.
Yeah.
You want solids and bright colors. They happen to be somewhat in fashion these days, or maybe hopefully I'm still wearing them. But it just makes it visually easier for people to find you. So it's something that's comfortable. You also want to be aware of if you're going to be mic'd up. If you have a lavalier, I think there's a huge market opportunity for lavalier microphone companies to make things that are a little bit easier for women, because I'll try to wear a belt, for example, or otherwise it's going to be clipped on to
Yeah.
the back of your dress. So get an idea of what the picture of the background is. A brighter color will help you stand out. Actually, one of my friends, and she's the woman who introduced me to my now husband, she met my friend, like, talk about how networking works, because they were at a networking event in DC and they were the only women there not wearing black or navy. And they just found each other across the room. So I guess I have bright colors to thank for. It's a big part of my life.
Yeah. Well, no, I love the idea that that you are helping people get a broader view of communications, because that you being on stage and making sure that your colors match or contrast enough that your message can be seen, because that's it. Okay. So then the next question is, if you were at this event and you probably had a PowerPoint, right? Or did you? Yeah. Okay. So you're in the shade. I mean, it's very rare that the speaker has a lot of light on them and the PowerPoint does. Did you have the light on you?
I did have the light on me.
Okay.
And so what I was going to say, like, in continuing the fashion, your slides are your accessory. And so the way this was set up in one conference event, I had huge screens to either side of me. It was 100% behind me. So, ideally the spotlight is on you. And I say this as someone who is highly introverted. It's like, it's you. It's not about you. It's for the audience. But the slides are your accessory, especially because, it is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when the technology fails. So that is another a reminder of slides are your accessory. It's on you.
Oh gosh. Well, that's when you feel like a rock star, really, at that point, when you have the big monitors everywhere and it's like, it's all me. Oh my. And it's like, do I look good from that angle and that angle? But yeah, I just wondered about colors, because I wondered if there were certain colors that made it easier for people to pay attention, or if you ever used background, just like in video, a lot of times you can embed background music and theme it a little bit so that that's part of your brand almost. Do you find any of those other aspects are important, or do you use any of those?
That's highly dependent on pretty much the host.
Okay.
There's, when there is a video or sound or auditory change, that is a great way to notify the room that something's about to change. And it's more about, I'm more focused on making sure that our speakers have an opening that's going to get the audience right away.
Oh, that's cool.
Because that is the best way to put on notice. And so that means I'm going to implore all of you out there to not start off with, we have a lot to cover. I'm so excited to be here. Let me tell you a story. Like, just go in, jump in and tell them the story, or start with a stat or a factoid that's going to make them smarter immediately, or maybe ask the big question that they're all wondering. And becoming more comfortable with the idea of having a more deliberate start is the most powerful way, beyond anything you're going to wear or how you stand. And I'm a firm believer in, the more the more confidence that you have that your content will resonate, then the rest of it follows. Then the body language comes in, then the pacing becomes easier, and you won't have that monotone. So it's doing the work up front to figure out what's the most compelling content, what's most important for this audience at this moment in time, running it by people, getting some feedback. That's when you get that excitement of, I cannot wait to share this with the people in the room.
Oh, and that excitement's contagious. It's really wonderful. So when you're helping people do this, are you finding that you have to come up with some breathing exercises or something to help them with their nervousness before they, even if they're polished, everyone still has butterflies, I think, before they go on. Do you have any secret weapons that aren't going to be so secret soon?
I draw heavily on Dr. Andrew Weil. He's a
I
wellness.
love it. Yes.
I've always seen him in Whole Foods. He's got the magazine. It looks like Santa Claus.
Yeah.
He has 4-7-8 technique, and you basically draw in for 4, hold for 7, and release for 8. And the nice thing about this exercise, it will relax. It's very relaxing, but it also helps you develop a more resonant breath because you're really breathing from your belly. Whereas when we get stressed and we're anxious, we're like, oh my gosh, I get called on. This is really bad, especially if you're virtual and you're leaning over your laptop, you're going to cut off your vocal cords. And that's where that timbre sounds, that little shakiness. And so once you hear the shakiness, then you become aware and it becomes that much worse. But the breathing technique can come in handy. We had a client a couple of years ago who was saying, I used to love giving presentations. I love talking about my work. And when she was asked to speak at a national conference, she was like, absolutely. And so she's sitting in the back of the conference, watching all these other speakers. And she realizes like, oh, like what I'm saying is interesting to Fairfax and Alexandria and Loudoun County, like very DC area, but is this going to appeal to people in California and Florida and Oklahoma? And so as she's walking backstage and going to the green room for her turn, her Apple Watch went off because her pulse had doubled. And so it was this life alert of like, beware. That's how much. And I've noticed too, I have to, there are certain situations where even I get more anxious. I will remove the watch because just being aware, like I want my heart rate to go up a little bit, but not so much. So the 4-7-8 technique, I tell speakers, like all of our coaches do, practice it on a daily basis so that anytime you're thinking about that presentation or your staff meeting, instead of letting those mental gremlins come in, you're going to do 4, 7, 8. And so that before you take the stage, you can draw on that because unless you know how to do it and you're in a habit of doing it, it's really difficult to get its maximum effect the first time.
Oh, I think that's a great tool to have in your toolkit. You don't need anything except your memory to do it, and you can do it anywhere. So that's excellent. Thank you. What are you finding is the biggest issues right now with the companies that you're working with? We're in a time of change. There's a lot of stress. We're in an election year. Yuck. Which is just full of total contrast and yuck again. It's all, nothing is about what good is in the world. It's all about all the terrible things. So are you finding people having to do different kinds of presentations or change anything because of this time period we're in? Because we had pretty much the lockdown changed a lot of people I talked to, it's like before COVID, after COVID kind of mentality. And then now we're post COVID, but we're still in kind of feels like a heated up environment. And I just wondered if there was other things that you're having to pull out of your toolkit to get more attention or get more cohesiveness with people's presentations, and create a way to reduce fear about decision making. I mean, because if you have fear, use freeze, right? You don't.
Right. Is you can absolutely get stuck. I would say with an election year, with a lot of industries that our clients are in, there's even more uncertainty.
Right.
So obviously, depending on who wins, which way Congress goes, so there's uncertainty that's percolating, and depending on the day, like, and I am not someone you want to listen to, like what shape the economy is. I simply think we don't know. So that always adds an extra layer of stress and tension. In terms of that conflict and, how easy it is to paint the other side as the bad guy. A couple of things. One is one of the most helpful diagrams we can use, whether it's a regular presentation, or especially if you fear that you're presenting to someone who does not agree with you, is to draw that Venn diagram and go ahead and write down all of the things you care about, the values, your priorities, your concerns, and then what you know about the other, and find out where that intersection is.
Oh,
And that's where you start. And, I was doing a guest lecture at the University of Virginia a couple of weeks ago with these incredibly bright, passionate fourth year senior students. And we were having this conversation about, what do you do when you totally disagree with the other person? And we're talking about, it's part of it's about the humanity of it, until you can see where you and the other person have something in common, that's the starting point. And change doesn't happen like it looks like in the movie. It's not some big, huge speech. It's one difficult, awkward conversation at a time. And, I think as speakers, there's this mentality of oh, I have to go and prove I know I know my topic. But unless you're bringing in that curiosity and that approachability, we're not going to learn from one another. And even though we're out of school, we are continuing to learn. So there's that Venn diagram. And the other thing that is the biggest trend, I would say, over the past 2 or 3 years, is because of the hybrid environment, younger professionals simply are not seeing how to resolve conflict.
perfect.
Or they're not having the conversations with managers before and after. So much of a culture is figuring out when and how can you disagree. Is it in a meeting? Is it afterwards? Is it before? Is it over email? And so the less we have this relationship building and modeling of being in the room and seeing how adults disagree respectfully, I think it's putting younger generations at a really big disadvantage.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it makes sense that problem solving is going to be more difficult without that, because you have to be able to see from each other's perspective to find that middle ground. And that's got to be difficult. So let's talk about your book a little bit, if you would. I'm sure you don't mind that.
Not at all. One of my other babies.
Could you share a little bit about it? It's your book's title is The Reluctant Presenter, which it sounds like, yay, perfect. Forget everything you know about speaking. So how did the baby book come to pass? What inspired you?
I think I always wanted to write a book. I've always loved reading books. And I think anyone who has a company is like, oh, I should write a book. And it wasn't until, I realized that we don't leave our reluctance to speak and present at work. It's not something we leave in our professional lives. And by this, I mean, so many of our clients and the people I've worked with, and this was certainly me, we just want to go to work and do it, put our head down and do our thinking and be as committed as we can. And it can feel awkward to talk about our work and convey an idea. And unless you know how to do that, your career is simply not going to move forward. And there are all of these things we say to ourselves that keep us from speaking up. I'm not going to have the right answer. I'm not going to sound stupid. I don't want to be difficult. And I did this in a medical situation. I was 30 weeks pregnant, and I still get emotional, even though I'm healthy. My daughter is healthy. We're all good, but I almost didn't flag the alarm. So that was my, this isn't something we keep at work. It's a part of our personality. And when I was writing it, so the thing about writing is it's who is your audience? And so I wrote it as a letter to my nieces, my nephew, and my stepsons, because they are all just starting out in the work world. And I think about those younger professionals, and this is advice that I wish I had back in the day. I mean, some mistakes they're going to have to make on their own. They're going to have to do firsthand. But there's so much. And I'm like, wow, if I knew that, I wouldn't have been so hard on myself, and I would have had more fun with it. And I would have asked my manager, hey, how did you get better at speaking? And, what does it mean to have a presence? And what do I do about imposter syndrome? So those are a couple backstories to the book.
Wow.
But that's what it is.
Yeah. So when people read the book, they're going to either say, oh, that hasn't happened yet, yikes, or they're going to say, oh, now I know what to look for. Does it also give some of these formulas that you mentioned earlier that you have? That it sounds like wonderful, not fill in the blank, but guidelines of
Call
how.
my numbers. Yep. Fill in my.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so and the book's doing well. You're happy with how
It's
it's
doing
turning out?
well, and it's, you never know where it's going to take you or who's going to order it, but it has been great. And the first part of the book is really about the mindset, about how you develop your confidence and presence, and the second gets more into that methodology of how to tell a story, how to do a briefing, how to rehearse. So yeah,
Perfect.
I highly recommend. I think everyone has a book in them.
I do too. I publish books, so yeah, I get it. So okay, so next question. How has AI changed what you're doing? Has it changed it or helped it in any way? Or has it been where people are using it out of the box too much?
There's two ways I think about AI with presentations. One is with the deck itself. And my team and I have test driven a lot of platforms out there. We do like the 2-week trials. We've done Microsoft Copilot. It's not changing anything yet. So for a couple of reasons. And I think it's because most of our clients are B2B, like there's very specific templates and things that people have to use. And a lot of the things are kind of cool and they're kind of rewriting. I'm like, I don't want you to rewrite the presentation. I just want you to see if you can turn this into some sort of more compelling graphic. It's not there yet. So not saving our clients time. It's not something we're actively recommending. I see Bright Carbon is a design company. They're figuring out how to use some tools that remove background images. So, watch that space. More is going to come. In terms of speaking, there are AI feedback mechanisms that will tell you whether you're using verbal fillers, your speed, whether you're too fast, too slow, you're right on spot. There are also ways that you can plug it in, as we do with our clients, to look for key phrases if they want people to stay on certain messages. So, I would say anything that gets you to rehearse is going to be great. The slides, not quite there yet, but I think my opinion on this is going to expire by the end of the year, if not sooner, because it's simply moving so fast. I did have a client who admitted that he had AI, a ChatGPT, write his upcoming speech. And I appreciate his candor, but I was like, oh, wow. And the speech that came out, like he fed in the talking points. It was fine. Like it was professional enough, but it lacked that personality. There wasn't connection. So if that's what you need to get to a first draft, go for it. But that on its own, it's going to be in one ear and out the other, unless you connect yourself to the content and connect that content to an audience.
I agree totally. But what I find is that a lot of times, well, ChatGPT 4 is a little bit better than 3.5 was. 3.5 seemed to give you less, 1 to 10 of everything. And what I found is that I would put something in there, and since I've been doing this so long, I would have used or thought of the first 7 or 8 of them and totally forgot about those other 2. And it was like, oh, a good reminder. I've never been able to use it right out of the box. It's so obvious if you do for copy. But okay, I got another question for you. Thank you so much for letting me pick your brain.
Of course.
On presentations where you're selling something, do you use testimonials? Do you recommend using testimonials?
Testimonials, when told as stories, can be more effective. I think it can feel a little awkward to be like, here's a quote from one of our favorite clients. So most of the people we work with don't relish the idea of sales.
Yeah.
That's you, or it's you pulling in those anecdotes of, hey, this is what it meant for one of our clients. That is a particularly compelling way, especially if that client can tell the story for you.
Great. Okay. So that's what there's some wonderful marketing coaches that say to make a sizzle reel, which is a compilation of maybe 4 or 5 testimonials into one little batch, and then you embed it into one of the slides. And then rather than you bragging about how wonderful you are, they do it. And those people are more like the customer or more like the audience than maybe you might even be, so that there's an identity. And several people have done really well with that model. So I wondered if that was still good after in this time.
I love that idea. I might even borrow that.
Yeah, I can show you some.
So often we think like this is what we can do for the client. So in our case, like this is what we can do for the speaker. But what I think it's easy to lose sight of is if you are the chief learning development officer or director of HR, it's a risk for you to bring someone in and take, time, attention, and introduce a new approach to doing something. And so the more people can hear from those, the other learning development, HR, CFOs, and other organizations who have worked with you, that's the social proof that removes the risk, because no one wants to be, the hardest customer is obviously the first one. No one wants to be that first customer in case it goes wrong.
Right. When I was at Arthur Andersen, I took this class from this gentleman named Mahan Khalsa. It was a fantastic class. I walked into it. It was very expensive. I used up a lot of my budget, my training budget going to it. And he was in white robes. He had long white hair in Arthur Andersen. And I walked into it. It was like, how did they sell that to everyone's in blue suits? I mean, it was pretty traditional. And so, I would have loved to have sat in on that one, how they sold that to HR to allow us. But it was one of the best classes I've ever taken.
Clearly, it sticks with you however many years later.
Yeah, 20 years later. Yeah. But the shock was like, this is a way off the normal path of linear thinking. It was more spiritual. It was a more spiritual class, which, didn't have many of those. So once more time, could you show us your book again and explain? I want to make sure that everyone can get it at your website through Amazon. So it's Portico PR.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, say that again because
Sure, it's Portico, Portico, PR.us. And so you can there's a link to the book. We have a blog. We also put a newsletter out through our LinkedIn page as well. So if you want tips, especially on how to help your team with their presentation skills, our LinkedIn page has a lot of that content. If you are looking for quick, easy, actionable tips on what to do, go to my TikTok, which I finally joined. It's at Meghan Dotter. So those are like these super short, quick, like if you're a speaker and want to get better, those are some ideas for you.
That's fantastic. Well, I look forward to learning more from you. Thank you so much for this. I think heartfelt and clear communication is our path to change. And I think what you're offering is just so necessary. I think right now you're in this niche, but it could be, I would say everyone watch Meghan, because she has a chance to have her information go to every niche that's out there. Thank you so much, Meghan.
Thanks so much, Kathy.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.